Welcome to the Springs in the Desert podcast. We're those friends that you can take with you wherever you are on the path of infertility. Hey there, Springs in the Desert. This is Jillian, your podcast host, and I am joined today by two of my favorite people to have conversations with here on the podcast. I always look forward to having Anne, one of our founding mamas, with us. How are you today, Anne?
I'm doing great, Jillian. Always glad to be with you too.
Yes. And one of our favorite guests, we have Chris O'Neill with us today. He has joined us for a lot of important conversations and I think has such a really wise and tactful way to speak about a lot of things that our community wants to hear about. And so thanks for joining us today, Chris. How are you?
Oh, it's always a great privilege to be a part of what you guys are doing in Springs. So things are well here. It's a little hot. Otherwise, we're doing good.
Send it my way. North Dakota, we're warming up, but it's still a little chilly. I'm just really grateful today to have this conversation with you. Listeners, today we're going to talk about a topic that we can't possibly cover all of the details and all the facets in one conversation. We hope to have a continued conversation about this topic, but we want to dive a little bit deeper into all the facets of in vitro fertilization, otherwise known as IVF. This is a topic that can be difficult to talk about. It's likely that you know someone or maybe yourself has had an experience with a doctor, a conversation about IVF or participated in that. And so we just want you to know first and foremost that we are here for you and that we want to point you to Christ, who is the healer, the Prince of Peace, the comforter, right? The one who knows us and wants to be there for us. And so with that, I just want to begin this conversation. Does the church talk about IVF? Are there places that we can go to as a community? I think it's always good to have kind of a foundation where we're on the same level. If we can go to a document or go to a resource, go to scripture, go to somewhere that we can be on the same page and start a conversation from there. I think that's always the best way. So, Anne, maybe if you would like to start us, and Chris, if you have other thoughts too, but where does the church talk about IVF or discernment about this topic?
Yeah, so the church does talk about IVF and a lot of other ART, artificial reproductive technologies. The church has a lot to say about human sexuality and marriage and love, which is also beautiful. But they do address these really difficult topics like the one that we're going to talk about here. And I'll let Chris expand a little bit more on some of the specifics of what the church says. But I just want to kind of preface all of that by saying that oftentimes, whether it has to do with human sexuality and procreation or just about any other kind of facet of our lives, definitely people who are outside the church, but a lot of us who are just trying to be faithful Catholics and followers of Christ, we can sometimes see the things that the church teaches as just restrictive and prohibitive and maybe trying to squash our freedom. And the other thing is, I think oftentimes, especially if we are struggling with a deep desire, like the desire for a child, and it is going unfulfilled, that can be so sad and frustrating and bring up all the complex emotions that we talk about in this ministry all the time. And we can wonder if the church is somehow against us, right? Does the church not understand the deep desire and the pain that is caused when that desire goes unfulfilled? So one of the things I'm hoping to have come out of this conversation is an understanding that when the church speaks about these things, she does so from a place of love and from a place of care for us and our bodies, for our mental and emotional health, our physical health, for the good of our marriages. So I think that's the foundation that we want to lay for this conversation, because you're right, it's a really hard one. And I think things like IVF are things that many of us have wrestled with. Even if Chris and we have a fancy degree from a pontifical institute, I think no amount of knowledge and study can prepare you for some of these heavy crosses that you encounter in life.
Thanks for that, Anne. I think that's an important context. So the question of where does the church talk about this? There's different and I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but there are different levels of teaching that the church has. And so there are things that the church teaches that are of universal implications, and that things that apply in every circumstance everywhere. And then the church has another task of taking those universal principles and applying them to particular cases. And so there's a couple of documents from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, or the CDF, and they're called instructions. They don't come straight from the Pope. They come from the CDF with the Pope's signature at the bottom. And it's in the instructions where the church is commenting on particular techniques, particular ways of approaching problems. And this is where you're going to find teachings on in vitro fertilization. There's two documents in particular, two instructions. One is Donum Vitae, and I think in Donum Vitae was the first time this was brought up in the church's understanding. It's a relatively new technique. Thomas Aquinas wasn't worrying about in vitro fertilization. And then Dignitas Personae, which deepened that understanding. And so there's been a conversation in the church and a discernment and coming to judgment about this. And the church is still in that process. They're still thinking this through. And what you'll see if you read those two documents in particular, I think you'll see a deepening awareness and a deepening understanding of what this is about and where does it land. And when I think also just to give kudos to Springs in the Desert. Springs in the Desert is an outcropping or a flourishing of that deepening understanding and a deepening appreciation of what is actually going on here in fertility, in fruitfulness in marriage, and in all of those things. And that's all a fruit of the church's discernment over time, and it's a participation in it. So those documents there. Now, because they're instructions, they're also very technical. They use technical language that are speaking about the state of the art at the time that the document was being made. It's not necessarily. So these documents are intentionally not applicable for all of the future. It's because techniques can change and different technologies can develop, and there's going to be a need of new discernment. But what you do see is a reflecting on the enduring principles that don't change, an enduring understanding of what it means to be human, the participation in the passing on of life that happens through masculinity, femininity, marriage, family. Like, it doesn't matter what the state of the art of in technology is. Men, women, marriage, family, children, sex, all of that is all like the principles, the physics that make all of that work is enduring. That's like the underlying nature. And so the church, it's not to say like the church's teaching on this can change. What's not going to change is the principles. And then the application in a particular instance is where the church has to discern. But in those documents, and just to be clear, the church is very clear that in vitro fertilization, for a number of reasons, this can't be acceptable from the moral perspective of the church. And that's a hard thing to say, because especially in the context of the people listening to Springs in the Desert, we know the profound and good and healthy desire for children. And we hear the church's call to be open to life, and we have a deep desire to participate in that nurturing and caring for another life as mothers and fathers. And so it can be difficult to say, okay, here's a path that's being offered to me that can get me to the end that I feel like the church is calling me to and that my heart really desires. And then the church is coming around saying, no, you can't go down that path. And that can be, to say that's frustrating is an understatement. So, and that's part of what makes this difficult. And, and a lot of people have gone down that path. Like, it's the state of the art. Like, IVF has now become so popular that it's the standard of care in some ways. And so that means there's a lot of people that have gone down this path and maybe not understanding it from a moral perspective, and maybe not been aware or have been really thought through how it affects the moral principles and their life, or how it affects the culture more generally. And so coming to an awareness of the evil of IVF can be a hard thing to bear, because that comes with some guilt. And nothing about what we want to say here has anything to do with trying to guilt anybody. I think I can speak for everybody else. I'm sure everyone else here will echo this. If you've gone down this path and maybe you have children, or maybe it's been successful or not, or whatever, it is not about like calling anyone out or calling them a bad person or saying that it's the difficulty of the burden of infertility has a lot to do with coming to terms with how complicated and hard life can be. And because it's complicated and hard, it's not surprising that people might make mistakes. And not only is it because it's complicated and hard, but also because maybe you didn't have the help you needed to not make a mistake. And so nothing here has to do with guilting somebody. It's what we want to try to do, or what I want to try to do, is just deepen our understanding and awareness of this issue. And as I said, begin a conversation that will help us to have a richer understanding of things.
Yeah, I just want to add something, Chris, because you were saying that IVF in some places has become like the standard of care. I have heard of people who have maybe not even gone a full year of infertility and already had a doctor say, listen, we can just do this. So I think there's this perception that IVF is this technique that just works immediately. And so I want to acknowledge that we may have some people listening who have gone through the process of IVF and do not have a living child and have really suffered heartbreak because of that, have suffered the loss of children through miscarriage, because the stats are not great on that either. So just to echo what you were saying, this is not about guilt and shame over what I did or what I thought about doing, or it's heartbreaking all the way around, and it's hard, and it's a cross all the way around.
Yep, that's right.
I think to take the conversation one step further, the reason why IVF exists, why Springs in the Desert exists, why so many conversations about this are happening, is because we have a desire for children.
Yeah.
And that's a good desire. That is a good, holy, healthy, beautiful desire. And it's when that desire is met with unfulfilled expectations, when it doesn't happen as quickly or maybe ever for a family. I know myself, sometimes I can tend to be an all or nothing person. I need someone to help me see the middle road. And what I typically see in these conversations is either kind of this, I think, a real zeal in trying to show that IVF is not the way that the church would lead, that it's unhealthy, and really I think an approach to that negative light, which, although true, can be critical and give the impression of shame and guilt. Or on the other side, that my desire for children is just so overwhelming, I will do anything to fulfill this desire, to try to meet in the middle, right? Like, we believe that God is logical and has created beautiful scientific help that might work in some cases. There's many examples you could give. A lot of times NAPRO technology is the conversation that comes into play here. I know for us, just even this is a conversation we've had on the podcast about natural family planning, about charting, about knowing your body, right? We're intelligently designed. So science is a beautiful thing. And this desire for a child is good. Neither can overtake, right, I think, the space. And I think you both we've really begun to address that middle road.
So there's another aspect of this that makes it very difficult. And that is, sometimes we're like judging other people. And so somebody's thinking about in vitro fertilization. They're like, oh, they must not care about the church's teachings on life or whatever. Or someone's thinking about in vitro fertilization. Leave those people alone. They have a real desire and they're trying to have a baby, and they should have every resource possible. And we're like arguing over somebody else. And we're taking positions, like we're putting ourselves in a place of judgment before them. When we do that, we're not thinking with the church. That's not how the church thinks about it. That's not how the church talks about it. Judging whether or not somebody, like the judgment of whether who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. That's the Lord's job. That's not our job. And then so again, that's not what we're doing here. We're making judgments about the reality of the situation, which is prudence and wisdom, and not necessarily affirming or condemning anybody. And then the second thing is, which is related, is that desire is really good. It's really important. That means it's also really powerful and it's deeply motivating. And that means that it's an economic driver. If you can be the kind of person who satisfies that desire, you're going to make bank. And so a lot of times you have industries that are built up around satisfying people's desires. And so there's an interest in, it's okay for you. This is a good idea. We can solve your problem. And we're not going to read the fine print about whatever the negatives, or we're going to suppress that, because there's a lot. IVF is incredibly lucrative business. And not to boil it just down to business, but that's an aspect of what's going on. And so the literature that you read, the research that you read, the people who are most motivated to put out information that is going to be on the side of go, we're not going to make a ton of money by saying, let's not do this. And so oftentimes the moral question gets drowned in a sea of advertisement. And that puts people in a very difficult position of signal to noise ratio, like sorting out like what's okay, what's not okay. This doctor told me it was fine, and then this other guy with a beard is telling me that it's not. Who is he, and what's that with the church? That's an element, and there's no way out of that. We just have to all do our own homework. We all have to make our own discernment and work our way through.
Yeah, those are really great points. And I'm glad you said that, because I can think back a few years when my husband and I had lost 2 children to miscarriage, and we're sharing it with some family and friends, and we weren't able to conceive. And yeah, that there were several people in our circles who had offered, oh, we did IVF and we have now X amount of children, and in an encouraging way. And I could sense in my mind, there are 2 ways, right? Like I can either judge that person or judge the action. And that's a really important distinction that you are making, to make sure this conversation is about IVF itself and not the people who perhaps participated in it, who have gotten encouragement to do that, who have talked to a doctor, maybe even someone in their life, some sort of spiritual mentor who has encouraged them, because maybe a lack of information, misinformation, or because this desire, like all the people in my life really wanted me to fulfill the desire that I wanted too. They were there to support me, and I'm sure our listeners too, right? Our family loves us and they want to support us in that way. And that can be a challenging conversation to navigate. Okay, so we've talked about the goodness of this desire to have children, that the church does speak about this topic, and there are places that we can go to see what she has said in her wisdom. But there might be some listeners, as we've already pointed out, who have participated in IVF. Some may not have living children, but some may have. Chris, you have a story that I think could help shed some light into how we can proceed with that conversation.
Yeah, one of those moments where this whole conversation, the reality of it all was brought home to me. Just very quickly, when Amanda and I were first married, we struggled with infertility, and then we had a couple of miscarriages. Our first daughter was born through NAPRO technology and different things like that. So we navigated all this, but IVF was never on the table, because I had studied the church's teachings, and I was pretty committed to this whole thing. And so it wasn't a temptation for me. And so there's ways in which for me, it was a little bit abstract. It was a little bit a teaching or a philosophical position or something like that. Anyway, so I went, studied, and then I was teaching at a high school. And when I was first studying this, IVF was still it still is relatively new, but then it was even newer. And there weren't a lot of actual IVF babies walking around. But then I was teaching at this high school, and I was teaching morality to juniors in high school. And there was a kid in my class who made it known right away that he was the product of in vitro fertilization. His parents had recourse to that, and here he was, a junior in high school, and smart kid, good-looking kid, liked by other people, good, solid family, real promising. Like, he was one of my favorite students in class. Like, I really, really enjoyed having him. And he was a thoughtful and bright kid. And he brought it up just before we were going to teach on this topic. And I went home, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? Like, how am I going to teach about this? I don't want to go into class and say your parents are terrible people or something, or that you shouldn't exist or anything like that. That's not how it works. And so I thought a lot about it. And I went to the documents and I was rereading them and in light of this. And one of the things that the church teaches is that the very process of in vitro fertilization as a byproduct results in the destruction of many embryos. And when I looked at that kid and I thought about that kid and I thought about how good it is that he exists, it made me think, where are his brothers and sisters? This kid is the kid that survived something really terrible. He was conceived in a very inhospitable and dangerous environment. And he was kept in a very, not in a place where he was welcomed and nurtured, but artificially held in suspension and then transferred. All of these technical processes that it takes, like all of the steps that it takes to accomplish IVF, he survived all of those steps. And his brothers and sisters didn't. And that made my heart break, because he's such a good kid, so good that he's there. But it brought home to me in a more concrete way the violence all along the way that this kid managed to survive. And that's the issue. Like, the issue isn't that it's not good that children come out of IVF, or that children who come out of IVF are somehow inferior to other kids, or anything like that. That's nowhere to be found in the church's teachings or in her whatever. What's there is that this whole process necessitates a kind of violent, not just attitude, but actual violent acts that are repeated over every step. And that's not acceptable. That's where the moral unacceptability comes from. Even if, which is not a thing, that there weren't other embryos or whatever. That's just not really a thing. That's not how it works. It's never worked that way. It can't work. But even if there was just only one, it's still, that child is not being conceived in a place where they're most cared for and nurtured. They're not in the safest, most healthy, nurturing. The safest and most healthy and nurturing place for a child is with its mother and it's with its father, and in a place that God created for it to be the best possible place. And that's been ripped out. And so it's a violence right at the heart of what's going on. That's what the church is trying to teach. And I felt when that occurred to me, and when I had to try to articulate that in the most charitable way possible, it meant that I felt the heaviness of that, the weight of that, the sadness, that this is how we've decided to solve our problems in our culture, is by using these means and not even acknowledging that we're doing this much harm. And so anyway, that kind of brought it home to me. And I met these parents. Like, they were good people. Like, they were well-intentioned, good people who sacrificed a lot for this kid and were obviously dedicated to, doing everything they possibly could for this kid. So there's nothing at all in terms of intentionality or whatever. It's a deeper problem than that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story, Chris. I think that, as you said, we can talk about there's the philosophical and theological components we can talk about. We can talk about the scientific pieces of this and the steps of the process and break it down. But this is real. We know people. We have friends, loved ones who have participated or were conceived in IVF. And so we always have to remember that, like, these real people, that listeners, if you are someone, if you know someone or you are someone who finds yourself in that situation, or like, you are good. And your desires are good.
Yeah.
And we just hope that this is the start of a bigger conversation.
I think one thing that we could say, because I do think that it's right for us to have a desire to make a judgment. If there's this much violence happening and we're doing that, like someone's responsible, right? Or something. I mean, there's a desire of justice that comes up, a desire for justice. And sometimes that desire for justice is misplaced by putting it on just as if it's the mom or the couple or whatever. We have an entire healthcare system. We actually understand very well the science that makes IVF possible. The doctors and the whole industry is not in the dark about what happens and how it happens and what are the risks. And it's decided to take these risks and then mask them for people. We shouldn't have to everyone be an expert in bioethics, in all the way down in the details of the technical scientific process of actually, we have our own work to do, right? We have our own areas of expertise, areas of knowledge, and we have to focus our attention on what our responsibility is. And we have to rely on others to fulfill their responsibility. So it's right that we rely on our doctors' advice. We rely on them to tell us what's going on. And I think a lot of the failure is there. And to be clear, like I know many doctors who got into reproductive technology type work because they wanted to help women have children. And it didn't take long for them to understand what these processes are and have come to the decision, look, I don't want to have anything to do with that. I'm not going to do that. That's not medically ethical to do. Many doctors have had to make decisions about the kind of care they're willing to provide. And in a lot of ways, that's part of what makes IVF expensive, is because there aren't huge numbers of doctors who are willing to do it. But the few that are willing to do it, the demand is high and the supply is low. Again, to go back to the economic thing. So yeah, it's a complicated moral question. And it's not the expectation that individual people bear the entire weight of the whole moral situation. Now, that said, you can't just shirk your responsibility to others as a patient. And everyone who's struggled with in vitro fertilization, anyone who's involved with Springs in the Desert knows the difficulty and the weight of that responsibility. And I think we all just want to encourage you in that, like to bear that responsibility as well as you can and get the help that you need so that you can carry that weight. And that's why an ongoing conversation is needed. If there's someone in a particular situation, a particular case, or some uncertainty, like any of us will talk to you and offer you the help that you need to bear
that's absolutely true. I think that's a great place to end this first part of this conversation, that we're all here for you listeners, and this and many other conversations are just so important to have. And sometimes it can be difficult to find someone who's willing to listen to all of the gamut of concerns and questions. And we certainly have people on our team and friends. We've got spiritual directors. We have a lot of people who can help walk you through a conversation about this. And so I just thank you, Anne and Chris, for having this important conversation and to really opening up, I think, some really good thoughts about how to talk about this topic and to continue. I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue this conversation. So listeners, just know that we are here for you. We're praying for you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us for this Springs in the Desert podcast episode. We would be so grateful if you took a minute to rate and review us so that we can reach more listeners. Don't forget to check out our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, and go to our website, springsinthedesert.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and community prayer list, read our blog, and register for virtual and in-person events. Most importantly, remember that God loves you so much, and so do we.